Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining the Emotional Eating webinar today. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy and finding ways to still be productive during this time where we're all social distancing. My name is Dawn Kurth. I'm a LiveGirl board member, and I'm also the founder of No Kidding Nutrition, a wellness company that helps individuals build better habits. So today's webinar is particularly timely as we're right smack in the middle of the coronavirus epidemic. And it's very common for us to turn to food for comfort. So while this webinar applies to emotional eating during any time, it's particularly relevant right now. Food is often used to self-soothe our emotions, and it's something that we often draw a sense of security from. So in today's webinar, we're going to be talking about and learning how to differentiate between emotion-driven hunger versus the true signs of physical hunger. We'll also learn some strategies to separate mood from food and go over non-food alternatives to feed yourself emotionally and learn how to deal with the stress in our life. We'll also dive into how to create the optimal environment to prevent unnecessary eating and lots more. So before we get started and throughout this discussion, I just want to remind everyone that we're all bio-individuals, which means we're all unique and very different. So what works for one person may not work for you. Keep this in mind along with self-acceptance and a loving kindness towards yourself. Because studies show that when we are overly critical of ourselves and we beat ourselves up for not being perfect, that it's much harder for us to change our habits. So I'll be speaking for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, during which time if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. And at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to try and answer as many of the questions as possible. Also, please have a paper and pen handy as we'll be doing a simple exercise, one that I typically do with my clients. So just keep that ready if you have something that you'd like to use, have it nearby. So I'm going to start with a quick client story and share this with you. Recently, a client came to me who was struggling with some of her eating habits. And what she would find is that she would eat healthy for a few days, and then all of a sudden she found herself reaching for what she called fun food. So cookies and ice cream, crackers, sort of all the snacky foods. And once she started eating these foods, she found herself feeling guilty, and then slowly it would become what she would fall into a food rut. And, I feel for her and I feel for people who go through this, but it's very common. And one of the things that she kept mentioning is that she felt like she was in this terrible mode of self-sabotage. So what I had her do was start tracking her eating habits. And once she started doing that, she began to see sort of what the patterns were to when she would, reach for these more snacky type foods and things that were not as healthy and good for her. And what she realized is that she often would turn to these foods during periods where she was spread too thin at home. She had 3 young kids, and often when her husband would be traveling. So she put a plan in place, and the plan was basically to carve out some me time. And she did this by, she wanted to start exercising and doing something more routine in the morning. And what she found is once she started putting this plan into place and having some time to exercise, which also meant communicating, with her husband so she could set up times. It was on the weekend so she could go to the gym. But she found new alternatives in order to replace some of the behaviors she was using before to soothe herself. And she found that this improved her mood and was helping her in many ways. So one of the first things that we have to do is identify triggers. And so what I tell my clients is that use a piece of paper, a calendar, an Excel spreadsheet, or an app on your phone, and start tracking your eating habits for a minimum of 3 days, but preferably 1 to 2 weeks. And some of the things that you want to include on this list are what you're eating, what time you're eating, where, maybe a particular room, or if it's you're in an office or school, maybe who's around you, and an emotion or feeling that's going through your mind when you're grabbing for the foods that are causing you to eat unhealthy. So think about it in a way like that you're gathering data. So you really want to put yourself into sort of the scientist mode, and you need data and you need to make observations. So are you finding that you reach for foods at the same time every day? Did you have a particularly difficult discussion with a colleague or a fellow student? Maybe there was a lot of junk food that you had 2 hours earlier, or processed food that maybe triggered some actual physical food cravings. So there's a lot of different things that you can find when you start tracking your habits. Sometimes we realize we're really not hungry at all, that we're actually maybe bored or lonely or frustrated. One other thing I suggest when people start keeping track of their eating habits to identify these triggers is to use a scale. And the scale would be from 1 to 10. And what you need to start doing is become more in tune with how hungry you are, how physically hungry you are. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 would be when your stomach feels practically almost empty, there's nothing in it, and 10 being you're so full that you're overeating, and you might even feel you've overeaten to the point where you feel discomfort in your belly. So kind of knowing where you are on the scale is another great thing that you can track. So for myself, one of the things that I had an issue with, a trigger for me, was nighttime. After dinner, a lot of times I found myself snacking and reaching for cookie after cookie. And I realized after tracking some of this for several days that what was happening is that I was eating out of some anger and some resentment. And that was coming from the fact that after dinner, everyone would leave the kitchen, to go do homework or whatever, and I was doing the dishes alone, and I didn't like that. I felt, quite like I was being disrespected. I also felt that I was rewarding myself for kind of doing all the kitchen cleanup. So what I was able to do is put into place some new expectations within my family, and by doing that, communicating to them what my expectations were, I was able to start getting some of the help I needed. But I also found that just in general for myself, I was getting triggered when I was in the kitchen. So what I started to do was pair anytime I was doing kitchen prep work or cooking with another activity that I enjoyed, which was listening to a podcast. So that way I could replace some of the emotional eating or eating out of just boredom or whatever it was with something that I enjoyed that took the place of the food. So the next thing I want to make sure we cover is actually knowing the different signs between emotion-driven eating and true physical hunger. So emotion-driven cravings or eating, you typically feel anxious, bored, depressed, sad, lonely, frustrated, nervous, or scared. But not all emotions are negative, right? In some cases, and for some people, being really excited or very joyful can trigger emotional eating. Just think back to the last time you were at a party or a wedding or something very celebratory. Maybe you ate a lot more or ate a lot of the things that you normally didn't eat. Physical signs of hunger include feeling lightheaded, dizzy, tired, maybe your tummy is growling, lack of concentration, you might get headaches or be easily irritated. So knowing the different signs will help you when you're tracking your habits and trying to be in tune with what you're feeling. Physical hunger truly will come on because of drops in blood sugar. So after so many hours after you're having eaten your last meal, your blood sugar levels drop, and this will set into motion a series of sequences that your body goes through to tell you that you're hungry. One of the other things that you should be able to identify is when you're eating emotionally, it kind of feels like an on-off switch. It comes on very rapidly, the desire to eat. Those desires to eat, or once you've eaten, usually are associated with feelings of guilt. Often you're not even that hungry. And that's where, again, using that scale and trying to track where you are on the scale as to your hunger levels. We'll talk a little bit about intuitive eating, but one of the things when you teach intuitive eating is that you begin to start eating when you're on the scale somewhere around a 3 or a 4 in terms of your hunger. And you stop eating when you're feeling slightly full, which would be somewhere around a 6 or a 7 on that scale. So again, emotional eating, you tend to eat when you're not hungry, but it also doesn't satisfy. Physical hunger is much different. It comes on much more gradually. You're usually a little bit more thoughtful about what you eat. Maybe you've planned ahead about what you're eating, and you tend to stop eating when you're full. Again, I like to use intuitive eating and trying to be really aware and attentive to the physical signs. Intuitive eating is more of a non-diet approach to eating. And not only does it use these hunger and satiety cues to determine when you eat, but it also gives you the permission to eat what you want and when you want it, although it brings in and incorporates nutrition and what your body needs to feel good. Okay, moving on. So the next thing that's really important if you're trying to tackle your emotional eating habits is to understand the role that stress plays in your body. This is what I like to call learning how to separate mood from food, because stress is one of the main drivers of emotional eating. So what happens in our body? What are the telltale signs when we experience stress? Well, first, the one thing I want to talk about is related to what happens in terms of hormones in our body. So when we get stressed, we release a hormone called cortisol. This is released by our adrenal glands. And once the adrenal glands release the cortisol, it inhibits insulin production, and it floods the body with glucose, and it favors the use of that glucose so that we can utilize it to move our bodies. Now, this was really important when our ancestors were fighting off a bear attack, right? So in order for them to utilize this fight or flight response, they needed quick energy. So that was the role of cortisol. Cortisol would basically signal the brain would release glucose. Glucose would power the body to either fight or flee, whatever was the danger at the time. But in today's day and age, we're not fighting or fleeing from any type of attack. But what we are experiencing is a lot of daily, low-level, chronic stress. And it comes from our ever fast-paced lifestyle and just a lot of, juggling too many balls at once. And what the problem is that now this glucose is just sitting around. It's not getting stored in cells, but it's sitting around in our system. And that's a bad thing. Excess glucose can cause a lot of problems. And one of the main issues, though, is that we start to gain weight, and this excess glucose is stored in our abdominal fat, or visceral fat is another way to, another term for that. So it's really important then when we are dealing with stress is to learn how to manage it, because it really will impact these cravings. Because one of the things that our brain is doing is telling us, in order to offset that impact of cortisol, is that it's going to make our body crave sugary and fatty foods, right? And so even though you would think that would help us, it does. It helps lower the levels of cortisol. It also helps raise our levels of serotonin, which is the happy or feel-good hormone. The problem is that we can't have all this excess food and this hyper palatable sugary, fatty food, which is what our body is craving, because our cells no longer are storing that glucose. They think they need something, and that's what they crave. They crave these sugary and fatty, hyperpalatable foods. So let's talk about ways that we can manage our stress. As I mentioned with my client story earlier, she used exercise. Exercise is a great stress reliever. Our body releases endorphins that make us feel better. Another thing is meditation or deep breathing. And I really feel that, I know this is much more popular these days, where we all are trying to take pause and be more present. But what happens is that our body cannot be experiencing a stress response and a relaxation response at the same time, because it comes from two different parts of the nervous system. They're controlled by two different parts of the nervous system. So whenever you engage in something like meditation or deep breathing or yoga, your body is in the relaxation response mode. So that's a great way to alleviate your stress and manage it, right? And so the idea here isn't that we have to avoid stress or that we expect to live in a stress-free world. The idea is that we learn significant ways that we can mitigate and manage our stress levels. So one of the things people always say is I hear quite often is that they don't enjoy meditation or they don't have time to meditate. Well, I can tell you from personal experience that you don't need to sit for 20 minutes in stillness twice a day in order to meditate. You can simply use your breaths, counting in and out. Like one way to do it is to count in for 1 and exhale on 2. And then again, 3, and exhale on 4, all the way up to 10, and repeat it. Another simple way to do a meditation is just to use the words re as you inhale and lax as you exhale. Relax. I'm also a big believer in 4-7-8 breathing, if you've heard of that. This is just a simple exercise where you breathe in for a count of 4, you hold it for a count of 7, and you exhale deeply for a count of 8. Repeat this 3 more times. I also suggest to my clients to try journaling. Getting our worries out on paper releases a lot of those emotional burdens that we carry around with us. And the process of writing, which is an encoding process for our brain, helps us really process and remember the things that we want to in terms of learning new behaviors. But just the act of writing these things down, there's been a lot of studies that even writing first thing in the morning is a great way to relieve a lot of the stress that you typically go through throughout the day. I also like to use gratitude practices. You can keep a list of things you're grateful for, or you can do 3 good things or 3 gratitudes at the end of every night before you go to bed. In our family, we used to do them quite often around the dinner table. So this is another great practice. And then another thing you can do is utilize a mantra. Something like, I will use food as fuel, not therapy. And I tell my clients that when you have a mantra or an affirmation that you find that really resonates with you, that you should not only say it multiple times a day, but write it out and maybe put it on a Post-it, put it on your bathroom mirror or on the kitchen refrigerator, even in the car on the visor, because the more you repeat it and say it out loud, again, the more you'll be able to experience a release from this stress. So another thing I wanted to talk about, and is a very important point, is that when it comes to emotional eating, gender matters. Indeed, there was a study in 2009 where they looked at brain scans of women, and these women were asked to smell and taste and observe things like pizza, cinnamon buns, and chocolate cake. And when they looked at those MRIs, those brain scans, they showed activity in the regions of the brain that control the drive to eat. However, this was not true for men. So while it may not seem fair, it certainly can explain why you don't often see, or you don't tend not to use food when they're stressed. It's something that's hardwired into the brains of women, and it definitely impacts, why we tend to reach for food more often than maybe our male counterparts. Okay, so for the next slide, I would love for you to get a piece of pen and paper. And if you could use the chat box when I ask if anyone would like to share, that would be the best way to share any answers that you put down. But here, what I'd like everyone to do is to list out 10 different non-food alternatives to soothe yourself. And the idea here is that you need to find a replacement activity for your emotional eating. And without having a plan in place and knowing what you're going to turn to, it's going to be very difficult to break that pattern of behavior. So what I like everyone to do is to start coming up with a few different non-food alternatives to soothe yourself. So these can be things that are like distractions, hobbies, reaching out for support, any idea. It doesn't matter what it is. There's nothing, no activity that I would consider to be too silly. The only thing is that, again, we're bio-individuals, and what is really important here is that this has to be something that works for you, something that you enjoy. So if there's anyone who wants to share at this point, I'd be happy to share some of the ideas. Okay, so here we go. We have some suggestions here. So one is walk the dog, drink a glass of water, read a magazine, doodle or draw, maybe exercise or spinning, having a cup of hot tea. I love those. Those are all great. Thank you. So cook or clean. Yes, I like if anyone follows Gretchen Rubin, who wrote Better Than Before and the Happier Project, she says, have a 2-minute exercise or whatever, like 2-minute chore. So anything you can do or in 1 or 2 minutes. So clean out a drawer. There's something just to distract you. The idea here is that you need to have the plan in place. Now, what I would do is then take this a next step further. And what I'd like you to do is come up with a series of if-then statements. So for example, before I give into a craving, I will drink a glass of water. If that doesn't work, then I will try doing a crossword puzzle. If that still doesn't work, then I will try having a cup of hot tea or something like that. And so the idea here is that you are putting into place some process-oriented goals, right? So now it becomes not about just all or none, this is what I'm doing, or is that you have a series of steps that you can put into process to help break the routine. And I really encourage you to try this, to keep this list posted, tape it to your refrigerator or, put it on your phone as a reminder. Nearly 56% of our habits today are actually, our actions today are habits that we do all the time. So coming up with a new habit, the easiest way to do that is also to pair it with an old habit. So again, whether or not, if drinking a glass of water isn't something that you normally do for just you probably drink water, throughout the day, but if you don't use it to stop maybe the eating habit, well, maybe you pair it with something else. So, if it's in the morning, maybe while your coffee is brewing, maybe you drink a glass of water so that you feel more satisfied and hydrated, and that maybe breaks part of the pattern. But again, just pairing something with an old habit to a new one is another way to start changing your behaviors. Okay, let me just close this. Okay, so the next step is to manage your mindset. And what here I'd like to focus on is something called having a growth mindset. Many of you have probably heard that term before. It's used quite a bit in schools these days. But the key here is that when you're having a growth mindset, or you adopt a growth mindset, that you feel that not only are you capable of change, but that you know that changing your behavior is going to be a learning process. And that process will have some setbacks and challenges. But rather than seeing those setbacks and challenges, you see them as opportunities to learn from. So these are normal and necessary. And I tell a lot of my clients that sometimes when you're trying to change your habits, it takes weeks or months. It could take longer, could take a year. But the more you accept the fact that there will be some obstacles along the way, and not every day will be perfect, the easier it is to move forward. The thing I like to tell people is to remember the word yet. And what I would say is, so when you are struggling with some emotional eating, instead of being too hard on yourself, remind yourself that I haven't quite found a solution to my emotional eating yet, or I haven't found a replacement activity for late night snacking yet. And so the whole idea is that you are priming your brain for the expectation that you will change, and you believe strongly in that change. So that's a really key thing. And I think a lot of people forget that, and that we tend to be really harsh and criticize ourselves about our inability to succeed at changing our behavior, because it will come, but it does take persistence and it takes effort. Okay. So along those lines, I encourage people to practice self-compassion. So there was a study done at Wake Forest University where they took two groups of women. They all told them they were participating in a food tasting study. And they divided those women into two groups. One group was given no instruction, and the other group was told, you're going to be doing this food tasting study. You're going to be eating some donuts, but don't worry about feeling bad about eating the donuts. Everyone has to eat them, and it's just part of the study, so it's okay. And then after this, they completed that part of the study, they brought them back, and they were put in a room, and there was a table of candies, on the table were a bowl of candies. And it was very interesting. The group of women who were given the prep talk before about not being too hard on themselves for having eaten the donuts, ate fewer candies than the women who were given no instruction. So the idea here is that when we give ourselves a break, when we tell ourselves that it's okay, we're just human, we tend to not fall down into that spiral of negative self-talk that often then puts us in that rut where we keep on continuing with bad, unhealthy choices in our eating. So the takeaway here is to really try to be more compassionate with yourself. One of the things I read recently was that food is the most common form of self-medication. Why? Well, let's see, we don't need a doctor's prescription for it, right? It's legal and it's available. So it's so easy to turn to. And I think when you realize that, that's a really strong reason why I turn to it. It's there, it's easy, it's available. So don't beat yourself up. We're going to learn strategies, and we're going to work through this so that we can get, we can change our behaviors, but realize that it isn't isn't you as the person. It's just, it's a very available, readily sought, and it easily soothes our emotions. So another thing I will ask you to think about is using acceptance statements. Acceptance statements remove the judgment and guilt associated with emotional eating. And the whole idea behind them is that you are, that you are enough, that you are doing the best you can in that moment, and that you know your body better than anyone else. And so to accept your body as it is. So a simple acceptance statement would be, I accept my body as it is with all its flaws and imperfections. Another acceptance statement example would be, I accept that when I'm stressed out about an upcoming, whatever, exam or test or meeting, that I sometimes use food to feel better. So basically what you're doing is saying that I'm okay, I'm human, I sometimes do these things, it is not the end of the world, right? So allowing yourself to remove the judgment and guilt will help you be able to better overcome your emotional eating. Another thing I suggest is writing out interrogative statements. These are statements in a question format. What this does is that it opens up the problem-solving area of the brain, and this curiosity allows you to feel more open to possibility. So for example, you could say, and what I tell my clients is try and use interrogative statements that begin with the word what or how. I mean, those aren't the only ones, but here's some examples. What step could I take right now that would make the most difference? How will this choice serve me? How do I want to feel in a month from now? The whole idea of being kind to your future self. So thinking ahead and asking yourself these questions. There are so many different ways you can ask a question, an interrogative question, that can help you really think about change and what behaviors you want to change. You know, one thing you could say is, what do I need to put on the back burner in order to make these changes now? So play around with this. You don't need to, come up with them right away, but, it's definitely a tool that I like to use because when you open up the problem-solving area of the brain and you give yourself this opportunity to see what the possibilities are to change your behavior, we reduce some of our fears, we reduce some of the judgments and self-criticisms that we experience. Okay. So another thing that is really important to understand is how sleep affects our emotional eating. So we talked a little bit about cortisol before, but there are two other hormones that get out of whack when we don't get enough sleep. So these two hunger hormones are known as leptin and ghrelin. And basically what happens is that when we are sleep deprived, some of the hormones in our body really just become, they don't work as properly as they should. So leptin is a hormone that basically tells us when to decrease our appetite. And ghrelin is the hormone that will tell us when it's time to eat. And when you don't get enough sleep, these two hormones don't work properly. Leptin is produced in our adipose tissue, which is our fat cells, and it signals the hypothalamus in the brain that it's time to stop eating. Now, when you don't get enough sleep, these signals aren't necessarily working properly. So how much is enough sleep? For adults, 7 to 8 hours a night of good quality sleep. For teenagers, 9 hours is a good number to shoot for. Sleep is not only going to make you less irritable, but it will lower your stress and it will help these hormones that regulate appetite and somewhat metabolism. There's other roles they play, but generally regulate appetite. They will work properly. Without proper sleep, you are making their jobs a lot harder. Sleep is also really important because a lot of things are going on that help with your digestive system, your immune system, and it's healthy for your brain as well when you get enough sleep. So I can't stress that enough. I find I've had a number of clients who have come to me with a lot of issues regarding their eating habits. And one of the first things I ask them is how much sleep they get. And if I find that they're getting like 5.5 hours of sleep, one of the first things we address before we address the food issues is getting their sleep better. Okay, so next thing we'll talk about is educated eating. And this is just to go over some of the main things in terms of food that will drive cravings and food that, is better to snack on. So what I'd like to highlight is just be aware of the strategic marketing of food. I think, going into the supermarket, it's really easy to be swayed by the way things are displayed and the commercials that we see. But most importantly is looking for hidden ingredients and learning how to read labels. So what I've done here is try to give you some of the foods that are known to trigger cravings. So foods that contain MSG are ones that will definitely be contributing to food cravings. So again, I'm a little bit differentiating between emotional cravings, but this does play a part in when we are feeling this drive to eat. And there's a lot of different ingredients that hide MSG. Usually the word hydrolyzed is something that you should look out for, but there's a lot of other different things. Natural flavorings is on a lot of different labels. And so you don't necessarily know how much. It may not be enough MSG in there to really cause any problems, but if you can, you want to avoid foods with MSG. Sugar and artificial sweeteners also are going to trigger food cravings. Anything that's processed or hyperpalatable foods, so your ice creams and your cookies, those have a lot of sugar and a lot of fat, and it will definitely have an impact on your desire to eat. Caffeine for some people can trigger cravings, and I say that knowing that for a lot of people caffeine is fine. What some of the research has shown is that it does affect our taste buds and makes them less sensitive to sweet, so that we might crave more and more sweets by having a lot of caffeine. Again, it may or may not be a problem for you. And then, of course, any refined flour products or products containing gluten. We're not going to go too much into the foods specifically, but just know that if you have a diet that's heavy in processed foods, heavy in sugar and artificial sweeteners, that you're much more likely to experience food cravings. So lastly, successful staging. So this is about creating the optimal environment so that eating healthy is easier for you than reaching into the cupboard and pulling out the junk food. So what I tell people is having your snacks visible. I like to use clear glass containers and pre-proportion certain foods. Anything, when you open your refrigerator, anything that is eye level should be something that you can eat without any worries. So whether it's your cut up fruit and veggies or hummus or avocados, you want to have that right center and easy to grab. I also like to have your snacks planned out in advance. I mean, I tell my clients to plan their meals in advance as well, but when you're looking for something and you're experiencing a craving that's driven by emotions, again, whether it's anxiety or worry or boredom or frustration, you want to kind of know what your go-to snack is. For me, we keep a big bowl of apples in our kitchen and blueberries in the refrigerator. I like to use those as my planned snack. That way, if I want to go and get something, I get that first. Again, it's not to say that you can't have a treat, you can't have cookies. It's just that you want to start off at least with something healthy. So what exactly do I consider a healthy snack? So I like to think of the letters PFF. So they should have protein, they should have some healthy fat, and be a good source of fiber. So there's the P for protein, F for healthy fat, and F for fiber. Some examples would be like a small handful of nuts or seeds. I'm big on like pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds because they have a lot, like pumpkin seeds have a lot of zinc, just minerals that we tend not to always get the full supply of. Avocados are great, hummus, or even an olive tapenade. They have great sources of healthy fat as well as fiber. So you're getting vitamins and nutrients as well as fiber and healthy fat all in one. When to eat a snack? You should have snacks whenever you feel physically hungry. So again, tuning into your body's own signals, like your satiety and hunger signals, and learning to be very attentive to the signs, right, that we talked about before. Are you feeling lightheaded? Is your tummy growling? Things like that. You want to not miss eating or skip a meal only to overeat and choose the wrong foods later. And again, these healthy snacks should be things that help stabilize blood sugar. And so by that, I mean, they should not be filled with tons of added sugars. They should not have, processed ingredients to the extent that you can. I do believe in treats, but I believe they should be used in moderation and, have them when you feel them and feel like it, but have have the healthy snacks be the majority of what you're eating. And I always tell people it doesn't really matter what you do once in a while in terms of your diet. It's what you do on a regular basis that's more important. So having the ice cream or brownie once in a while is fine. Okay, so just lastly, I know we had wanted to address how to talk to kids about healthy eating, and I'll just wrap this up with this slide. I like to tell parents that when you're talking to kids of any age about food and healthy eating, is that you really want to describe it as this is fuel for your body. And I know that's a pretty straightforward analogy of you wouldn't put the wrong gasoline in your car. But when you think about eating nutritiously, it's what foods make your body feel great. And so I'd like to emphasize how these foods make you feel, right? When they give you energy, when you feel like satiated and not overly full. These are foods that, again, are going to be more natural and whole foods as opposed to processed foods, but avoiding talking about food as a way to lose weight or food's going to do something that's bad for you. I try to avoid talking about it that way. So labeling foods as good or bad is usually not the best tactic. Just stick to, that eating properly will help you stay healthier. It doesn't mean that you won't get sick, but it means when you get sick, your body and your immune system will be working better because they'll be stronger. You should know that roughly 95% of your immune system is located in your gut and your microbiome. So one of the best things you can do is have a healthy diet. And then the last thing is walk the talk. So for parents, if you're eating the wrong foods or you're drinking sugar-laden beverages, then it's going to be hard to be a good role model for your kids. Let them see you eating it. Kids sometimes take 10 to 15 times to try a food before they like something. And I tell the parents, talk to them about that. Let them know, hey, you've only tried this 2 or 3 times. I don't expect you to like it, but just, keep persisting use observational language. So instead of saying you didn't finish all your peas, say, I see peas on your plate, or whatever it is. Like, so just state the facts. I see you haven't eaten this, or that, whatever is the food that, you know, they're avoiding. But I would say one of the things with learning to teach kids how to eat healthy is just being positive and picking your battles and being persistent, because over time, if you keep serving things and trying to put healthy foods in front of them, they do tend to start eating them. And so with that, I will wrap up and see if we have any questions that I can answer. All right, so let's just see. I'm gonna pull this up. Okay, sorry, let's go back here. I think there was one question. Allison, I don't know if you can still hear me. I know there might have been one question.
Yeah, sure. So I can go ahead and read it to you. Sound good?
Yes, thank you very much. It wasn't clicking.
Sure. So it says, Dawn, thank you for all this information. Very helpful and informative. With teens, how can we encourage healthy eating without overemphasizing and perhaps fostering risk of eating disorder, especially in New Canaan, where there is such a high value on how you look, working out, being thin, etc.?
Yes. So I don't know if that person was here for the last slide, but basically,
yeah, exactly, you're on.
Yeah, so. I'll just repeat basically what I said, but I try to not label food as good or bad foods, but talk about few foods that make our bodies feel better, make us have more energy, make us, you know, if we're an athlete, that, you know, gives us the optimal fuel to be faster, stronger, and really about what our body needs to stay healthy. And again, this is I define being healthy as not that you never get sick. It's just that your immune system, because you've been giving your body all the nutrients it needs, is able to respond and get you better quicker. So it is a difficult thing, and I know in this area there's a lot of emphasis on body image, and again, trying to model for your kids. And, you know, then this is where I think even using the affirmations, the acceptance statements, like I accept my body, you know, in all its beauty with its flaws and imperfections, things like that. There are a lot of different affirmations. You can even just do a search in Google that have to do with body image. Because again, the whole idea with acceptance statements is that you are enough, right? And that you don't need to look a certain way to impress other people or please other people. And that you, in your uniqueness, is what makes you you. So that's what I would recommend.
Thanks, Dawn. And we also have a question about teenagers that don't like to eat breakfast.
Oh, yeah.
Always told is the most important meal of the day. Is that true? And eat breakfast given the early hour.
Yeah, I know. Okay, thanks. That's a great question. So a couple of things. It is different for different people, but what I would say is let's start in the evening and look at what is being consumed in terms of food and drink and at what hour. So in order for your digestive system to really kind of clear everything out and do what it needs to do, the recommendation is that you stop eating 3 hours before you go to bed. So if you're going to bed at 10 o'clock, so that means, you know, 7 o'clock dinner. Now it's teenagers and playing sports or activities, whatever it is, dance. Sometimes that's hard. And that's where maybe having some more what I call mini meals in between the lunch and dinner, because that way you could have a lighter dinner. But I would say if they're truly not experiencing hunger and it's not impacting them later on in the day, then, you know, it's going to be hard to force them to have breakfast. And there's a lot of differentiating research now, you know, saying about intermittent fasting and starting, you know, to eat in a narrow window. I emphasize with all my clients, we are all unique, and our bio-individuality is going to tell us what's best for us. And even the experts disagree. So I would say, if you feel well and you're healthy and you don't have any issues, whether it's being, you know, feeling like a slump at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, then it's fine maybe to not have the breakfast. But if you're having problems later on in the day, or you're having an issue with your weight, or craving the wrong kind of foods, then I would start having a small breakfast. Make sure it includes protein. That tends to help us feel satiated and keep our blood sugars more stable. Okay.
Thanks. Well, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Take care.